Breaking news from our latest intelligence reports. The headline is this: Bulgaria to join Euro. A setback for Putin as war with Ukraine is escalating. The date is January 1st, 2026. And look, this is so much more than just switching currencies. This is a huge geopolitical realignment right on Europe's eastern flank. It's really a strategic defense move, just disguised as a financial one. Subscribe to Defense Reports. It's your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports. I'm Alex. Join me for a sharp, no-nonsense breakdown of the latest in global defense news, military technology, and strategic developments. And today we're covering the official adoption of the euro by Bulgaria.
That's right. They're becoming the 21st member of the Eurozone.
And this move is absolutely framed by geopolitical necessity. It's deeply, deeply entangled with the war in Ukraine and, of course, the ever-present threat of Russian hybrid warfare.
Welcome. And the sources we've analyzed for you really show this is not just some bureaucratic change. Bulgaria is, in effect, hardening its core infrastructure against malign influence.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to really get into the sources you've shared with us.
Exactly. We're covering Bulgaria's economic readiness, the intense political fight against Russian disinformation, and the critical security implications this has for Europe's collective defense.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the headlines suggest a smooth transition, but the details we found, they tell a very different story. They frame this as a direct win in the ongoing conflict.
And we should just get right to those key findings now to show you why this matters so much.
Let's do it. First, the immediate shock of U.S. sanctions against the Russian energy giant Lukoil. That was just back in October 2025.
It forced Bulgaria into a desperate defensive move, banning fuel exports to the EU just to stop its own economy from collapsing. It really put their unique dependence under a microscope.
Second, we looked at the financial weak spots Russia loves to exploit. The data is pretty shocking.
It is. Illicit financial flows in Bulgaria and the Balkans are around 6% of GDP.
Which is way, way above the global average.
And this financial leakage is exactly how Moscow funds its influence operations. The euro is meant to be a plug in that hole.
And finally, there's this massive strategic asset Russia basically gets for free, thanks to current policy.
The idle Trans-Balkan pipeline. It has a huge capacity, 17 billion cubic meters per year.
If that pipeline were restarted, it would instantly, dramatically cut Moscow's gas leverage over both Ukraine and a key NATO partner, Hungary.
But right now, it's a silent gift to the Kremlin. So let's start right there with the big picture. Adopting the euro isn't just about balancing budgets. It is a direct counter to Russian geopolitical power.
So the sources really frame this as a victory in the hybrid war.
A huge one,
Yeah.
especially in Southeast Europe, a region Moscow sees as, highly vulnerable to its tactics.
When we saw the pushback, didn't we? This was a real political fight.
Oh, absolutely. Pro-Russian groups like the Vazrajdan Party were all over it, online and in the streets.
Well, what were their tactics? What was the disinformation they were spreading?
It was all about fear. Pure fear and nationalism. They ran campaigns with these completely false claims about the government confiscating people's bank accounts.
Just seizing savings as part of the transition.
Exactly. And they played on this deep-seated fear of losing the lev, their national currency, tying it all to poverty and a loss of national identity.
What's so fascinating that this gives the move its real strategic weight
Yeah.
is the link between the euro and fighting corruption. One analysis we read said the euro is a setback for Russia because it's just more traceable than the lev.
That is the core mechanism. When you join the Eurozone, you're plugging into the EU's entire anti-money laundering framework.
Which means more oversight.
Way more. Fewer large cash deals, more scrutiny from the European Central Bank. It just makes it so much harder for Russia to secretly finance its spies, its saboteurs, and its political proxies. It closes a huge door.
Speaking of conflict, that Lukoil crisis from a few months back is a perfect snapshot of Bulgaria's vulnerabilities. You said the U.S. sanctions in October were an escalation. Why so aggressive?
Because they didn't just target Russian oil sales, they went after the entity itself, Lukoil. And since Lukoil's Neftochimburgas refinery is the biggest fuel producer in the region,
The whole system was at risk of paralysis.
complete paralysis, which is why Bulgaria had to react so drastically.
But why couldn't they just buy fuel from their neighbors if the refinery shut down?
That's the strategic trap they were in. The regional market, Romania, Greece, even Hungary, they just couldn't cover the gap. A shutdown would have been catastrophic.
So they banned exports of diesel and aviation fuel.
Had to. It was a national security measure to protect domestic stability and prevent, crippling price hikes.
And that crisis really brings us to that other piece of the energy puzzle. Yeah, giant gas pipeline that's just sitting there, empty.
This might be the biggest piece of leverage Russia still holds, that old Trans-Balkan pipeline with its 17 BC meter capacity.
It's vital.
It's idle. Meanwhile, Ukraine's biggest gas import route is via Turk Stream, which is fed by Russia and runs through Hungary.
So if Bulgaria reactivated that TBP pipeline,
It would give Ukraine a massive, realistic, non-Russian energy alternative, practically overnight.
and that would weaken Moscow's grip not just on Kyiv, but on Budapest too.
Precisely. The failure to use that pipeline is a self-imposed weakness that helps the Kremlin, and getting into the Eurozone, with the stability that brings, is seen as the first step to finally tackling these huge infrastructure projects.
Okay, let's pivot a bit. Let's look at the financial foundations here. The sources paint a picture of an economy that's, well, it's stable, but it's definitely still playing catch up.
The macro numbers suggest they're ready. GDP growth was solid, 3.4% in 2022, and it's forecast to stay around 3.1%. That's better than the EU average.
And their public debt is incredibly low.
Exceptionally low, around 24% of GDP, or one of the lowest in the entire EU. They are very fiscally disciplined.
But they still have that problem that comes up in all the reports, the convergence gap.
That's the reality. Even with good growth, their GDP per capita is still the lowest in the EU, about 2/3 of the average. So they're moving in the right direction, but from a long way behind.
Now, the actual monetary switch is a bit simpler for them because of how they've managed their currency for decades. Can you explain that currency board thing?
Right, that's key. For almost 30 years, the lev has been rigidly pegged to the euro. A currency board means your independent monetary policy is already really, really limited.
So adopting the euro just makes that official.
It formalizes a decades-long reality. It reduces the risk of a big monetary shock.
So if the currency was already pegged, what's the actual day-to-day upside of full adoption for, say, a Bulgarian business?
The benefits are pretty substantial. For the country, you're looking at sovereign rating upgrades, lower borrowing costs. That frees up a lot of capital.
And for businesses?
No more currency conversion costs within the Eurozone, faster cross-border payments, and way less foreign exchange risk. It just makes everything smoother and more predictable.
But I think for a country facing these kinds of threats, the most important benefit has to be the financial security blanket.
Without a doubt. You get access to the European Central Bank's liquidity support. That's a massive backstop in a crisis. And crucially, you can join the European Stability Mechanism.
The Eurozone's firewall.
It's a huge institutional vote of confidence.
Yeah.
And a powerful defense tool against financial destabilization.
Let's make this concrete. The last country to join was Croatia in 2023, right in the middle of high global inflation. What did we learn from their experience with the biggest public fear price hikes?
Croatia is the perfect case study. Their borrowing costs dropped right away, tourism got a nice boost, and on inflation, which everyone was worried about.
The fear was that shopkeepers would just round everything up aggressively.
Exactly. But ECB President Christine Lagarde confirmed the effect was tiny. It added maybe 0.2 to 0.4 percentage points to inflation. Very modest, very short-lived, even in that tough environment.
So that real-world data really helps deflate the disinformation we were talking about earlier.
It does. The benefits are measurable, and the feared costs historically are very manageable. But despite those clear benefits, you can't ignore the domestic challenges. The sources are very clear that the public fear about inflation is still real.
Especially for things like food and housing.
Right, where speculation could become a problem without the government keeping a close watch.
And now they're locked into the Eurozone's demands. The IMF actually laid out three non-negotiable tasks for them to keep things on track and stop the economy from overheating.
Task 1 is all about strict fiscal policy. They have to tighten their belts. That means slowing down public sector wage growth.
Which is always a painful political move.
Always. And they have to get the pension deficit under control. Spending needs to focus on long-term investment, not just fueling short-term demand.
Okay, task 2 is about watching the financial system itself. What's the specific risk there?
The risk is a boom turning into a bubble. Rapid credit expansion, overvalued real estate. So the IMF's advice was to be ready to tighten what they call macro-prudential policy.
Which, for our listeners, just means using tools like raising capital requirements for banks or putting limits on mortgages.
Exactly. It's about tapping the brakes to prevent a crash later on. Proactive stuff.
And the third task gets into those really deep structural problems. Demographics, governance, things that are tied directly to security.
These are the hardest ones. They need major reforms to boost productivity. That means building stronger institutions, making state-owned companies more transparent, and critically, tackling the brain drain and aging population.
They need to attract new talent.
They do. Or they won't be able to sustain growth in the long run.
And this all feeds into another problem the sources kept highlighting: chronically low investment.
Exactly. Their fixed capital formation is consistently about 5 percentage points below similar EU countries. But it's not just about private sector reluctance.
It's about public investment not working.
Right. One source had this staggering statistic that in 2022, less than half of a €4 billion investment program was actually spent. Political instability and problems with procurement mean that potential is just being wasted.
Which brings us to the elephant in the room. The single biggest vulnerability, the one Russia actively exploits: the governance gap, the corruption.
The sources are blunt, one called Bulgaria the most corrupt country in the EU.
And this is where the economy and national security really merge.
They absolutely do. Those governance gaps are an open door for the Kremlin. Moscow doesn't need to invade if it can just buy influence and capture key institutions from the inside.
And that influence is paid for with those illicit financial flows we mentioned. 6% of GDP is a massive number. How does that actually work in practice?
It works through secrecy, opaque corporate structures. That money gets laundered and funneled into these powerful, often Kremlin-friendly oligarchic networks.
And those networks then use the cash to buy up media outlets and control political parties.
Precisely. Weak land registry laws, shell companies. They allow Russian interests to maintain deep political influence, even inside an EU and NATO member.
But if the euro is supposed to increase traceability, and the EU has all these anti-money laundering rules, why is enforcement against these networks still so weak?
The sources point to one critical flaw: a lack of rigorous, timely follow-up. The courts might confirm sanctions for market manipulation, but the actual process of investigating, proving, and dismantling these complex networks.
It's just too complicated and slow.
Frustratingly slow. And that delay gives these networks all the time they need to adapt and keep operating.
Let's connect this back to energy. How does this corruption problem affect their ability to decouple from Russia? We talked about the idle pipeline. What about their power sector?
The energy sector is still very heavily state-controlled. The regulated electricity prices basically act as public subsidies.
And what's the consequence of that?
The consequence is that the system protects older, costlier, higher emission sources, mostly coal. It delays the green transition and leaves the whole sector vulnerable to political pressure.
And that political vulnerability is stalling key laws. The sources mentioned a new law on energy, which is critical for modernizing their electricity market, is basically stuck in limbo.
Exactly. Political instability is the thread that ties all of this together. The struggle to pass that law puts their entire EU-funded recovery and resilience plan at risk. When governments are unstable, it creates a vacuum that foreign actors are more than happy to exploit to stop reforms that threaten their interests.
So, wrapping this all up, what does it mean for the immediate future? Bulgaria adopting the euro is, without a doubt, a huge strategic win. It's a step toward integration, stability, and resisting that malign influence.
Absolutely. It's a clear win for the broader European project and a definite setback for Putin's strategy of destabilization.
But there's always a but.
There is. The full benefit, especially when it comes to energy security, to using that Trans-Balkan pipeline to actually help Ukraine, that all depends on whether they can succeed with those internal governance reforms we talked about.
So the financial framework is now stronger, but the political foundation is still shaky.
That's the perfect way to put it.
Which leaves a final provocative thought for you to consider. If euro adoption gives Bulgaria new tools for financial stability and traceability, will the country finally be able to use that integrity to dismantle the oligarchic networks that enable foreign interference? Or will domestic political instability continue to get in the way, allowing Moscow to keep its foothold in those critical sectors?
Europe's ability to secure its southeastern flank really hinges on the answer to that question.
You've been listening to Defense Report, where we analyze the latest in military strategy, global defense, and advanced weaponry. Subscribe to Defense Reports, your go-to source for timely, in-depth military and defense reports. We'll catch you next time.